Hi, welcome to Beyond Limitations with Dawn Marie. Today I have Christie Werts with me, and she is going to be talking about adopting her husband's ex-wife's baby through the foster care system. Welcome, Christie.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. My name's Christie Werts. I live in Ohio and I have 5 children. We are a blended family. My husband and I have been married for almost 7 years. Right when we were kind of getting into the mix of joining a family, becoming a blended family, we get a phone call from my husband's ex-wife's sister, who, even though they were divorced, my husband also, he had custody of his 2 kids because his ex-wife unfortunately struggled with addiction pretty badly. So she called my husband one day and just said, "Hey, we are just now finding out that her sister was in the hospital. She was still actively using. She ended up with COVID and things didn't look good for her health-wise." And going back just a little bit, they actually hadn't spoke to my husband's ex-wife in over a year, which even through her addiction issues, she still would randomly keep in touch with at least her sister and let her know what she was doing. But nobody had heard anything in over a year. So when she got admitted to the hospital, that's when my husband's ex-sister-in-law technically let us know that she was also 33 weeks pregnant. So she ended up having baby on Monday, and she unfortunately ended up suffering a stroke, and she passed away that Friday. So during that process, we were kind of getting in touch with CPS because we knew already that she had tested positive. So had baby, that it would most likely be that this child would end up into the foster care system. I myself was a foster kid, and that was something I did not want, especially knowing that, this little boy was my technically stepkids, even though I consider them my kids, half siblings. I let the CPS know, like, we would be more than happy to take them, like, what would we need to do? And so we lived in Ohio at the time, and the baby was born in Texas, and they said, well, we could do an interstate transfer, but excuse me, that could take up to a year, which then would be placing him into foster care, which, I don't know if it was going to be one home, multiple homes. When you go into foster care, you don't know what's ahead of you. And I said, okay, well, what's the other option? And they said, well, if you were in the state of Texas, then you can go through the licensing process. And so, even oblivious, because I was a foster kid, but I was on the other side. I've never been on the foster parent side before. So I always thought licensing just meant, they would do a background check, make sure we were safe, no criminal records, financially, responsible. But finally, I was just like, what exactly is licensing? And they said, oh, you have to become foster parents. I remember kind of like my heart sank again because when I was in foster care, I experienced a lot of trauma personally, and I just swore that I would never go back to that system again. I mean, I've helped children. I was a youth leader. I had a home daycare at one point, but just foster care system in general was very traumatic for me. But I also knew that if I didn't step up, there was no way my husband, on his own would have been able to, and I just didn't want to even imagine him going to foster care. So we ended up selling our home in Ohio and we moved to Texas. We found a house pretty quickly, and Levi was placed with us. So it was kind of a journey of going through that process of foster to adopt in the beginning. Now, obviously, during that time period, they would reach out to biological family first because that's always priority over anybody, within the foster care system. But unfortunately, even Levi's biological father, he had struggles and at one point just went completely MIA, and the rest of the family just didn't step forward. We began this process, which was not easy when we moved. At the time, my husband was a crane operator, and we were going through this process for a little over 16 months, and I believe he was gone about 13 months. So, during that 16-month process, it was pretty much just me and all these kids with a newborn baby, and I'm 50 now, but at the time I was like 47. So
Wow.
restarting at 47 with a newborn, it was a lot different than when I was in my 30s. The last time I had a newborn, I had the getting up every 2 hours, and then also making sure that my other kids were, mentally even okay, because they had given up their school, their friends, even their sports, to go on this journey to adopt Levi. So it wasn't an easy process. In addition to that, when you become foster parents, you have these very long interviews with different social workers where you're getting licensed, and they ask you, I think my interview alone was over 3 hours of them asking me questions about my background. And I just remember being like, my hands were sweating, and I was just so nervous, because I thought, if I shared my background and my childhood, like, is that going to like disqualify me? Are they going to look at me and say, maybe you still have some lingering trauma issues, and then not go forward? And then, I couldn't imagine what would happen, to Levi. But as I went through it, it actually in some ways worked in kind of in my favor, because I really could understand what it was like to be a foster kid, would be more mindful of it. Now, granted, he was a newborn compared to I was a young teenager when I was in the system. I had to revisit my trauma. Oddly enough, going through the classes to become a foster parent, they teach you, and you learn so much about trauma and how it relates to certain behaviors, and, I guess what possibilities you could expect, because, no matter the circumstances, it's traumatic for a child to leave their biological family and to go be with other people. Now, even though Levi was a newborn, he still, I'm sure, experienced trauma, because, all he knew, before him being born, was his mom's, heart rhythm, and he knew her voice, and, all of a sudden he's into the world, and that's taken from him. Through that, I got to, recognize things that I could see, not only just having a child that is exposed to drugs in the womb, but realizing certain traits that I even still did as an adult, because I experienced trauma. So what I thought was going to be a very scary situation for me ended up being this very healing journey, even though it was a very tragic way that Levi and I met. It just kind of blossomed into this just love story between us. I was a foster kid. He's technically a foster kid. And we just kind of created this, bond together, even though, he was little. We were just very close, and I was just very protective of him. And it was just wonderful. Even on sleepless nights and being up all night, or when days he would be really sick, or just visits after visits, because when we were into the thick of being licensed, I had like 4 different monthly visits by different people. We had a CASA worker, we had a state worker, we had an entity that did our licensing, and then you got social workers coming, and then court dates. Even on days that I would cry and say, this is so hard, and harder than I thought it was going to be, just seeing him play with his siblings and knowing that they would never have to wonder where he was, what was he like, what does he look like as he's getting older. I got to witness firsthand, them build a sibling bond. And so, yeah, it was a journey that I did not expect it to be the way that it was. Even I got asked once, like, what was it like, or did I have any hesitations, like when I first walked into the NICU to go meet Levi. And I share in my book that at one point when I was flying from Ohio to Texas, because I had gone ahead of my husband, because Levi was going to get released from the NICU. I remember crying in the little airport bathroom. I was just crying for this mom, because I also had a mother that struggled with addiction. And, I had a lot of resentment and anger towards her growing up. But as I blossomed into an adult, especially through my faith and learning forgiveness and grace, I learned that addiction can happen to anybody. And it's the addiction part that makes society turn their back on them, or forget that, they were once human beings that just got trapped into this, unfortunate, addiction. And I was also crying because I was like, well, how's that going to feel? Like, I'm walking into a very different circumstance. It's not a circumstance of I just had a baby, or like most people, if they even sign up to be a foster parent, they kind of know it's coming. Or even when you get on an adoption list or anything, you know ahead of time. I mean, I literally had a week, and I didn't know how I was going to feel, but I remember just walking into that NICU, and I like instantly fell in love with this little boy. And funny enough is, even now as he's growing, he looks more like me than he does his, biological family. And I remember when I first FaceTimed my older daughter, she was like, wow, look at his nose. He has our nose. Like, he just, it was kind of, I don't want to say meant to be, because there's tragedy behind it, but at the same time, I kind of feel like it was a little bit meant to be, because just how everything ended up kind of working out. And so it was definitely a unique journey. When our story went viral, I just wanted to kind of just share a part of our life. I never really expected it to kind of blow up the way it did, because in my mind, I was just thinking, we're just doing the right thing. That's the right thing to do. We know about this, and, we should step up for him. But if I really think deeply about it, I think that it just has so many different twists and turns. I'm the ex-wife, even my husband on the ex-husband perspective, who's not the biological father, selling your home and, doing all these things really in the name of love.
Right.
It was just it was just a really neat journey. And so now he's 3 and completely bossy. He bosses his siblings around. He bosses us around. It's different when you have, because I have, my oldest is 22, then we got a 16, 15, 11, and then a random 3-year-old.
Yeah.
So the 3-year-old, just, he's the center of attention, but at the same time, he's just so loving, and he's very smart. And even this morning, I was getting out of the shower, and he was like, Mommy, you're my sunshine. And, and even on days where, he's toddlering hard, and I still get very emotional on the journey that led to this little boy, running around our house. And,
Mm-hmm.
it was just it was an amazing journey. I just never thought I would see myself in the foster care system again, but sometimes God has other plans for us, and he surely had one for me. And like I said, I didn't expect this journey to be a journey of healing and love.
Right. Now, when you went to Texas and you started to care for him, you had nothing. Before you have a baby, you have a shower. And so you had nothing. How did you get everything to take care of him?
So it was funny. So we found out about him on that Monday, and I think after mom had passed away, and we had talked to CPS about us possibly taking him. At first, actually, the new social worker said yes, that would, we could set it up where somebody can come to your home there, and we can do the transfer. So go ahead and buy a crib and all the things that you need, so that way when they come and you have a room set up for him, they know.
Mm-hmm.
She was new, so she didn't know any better. So we went out immediately. We went to Target, and last minute notice of buying everything you need for like an unplanned newborn baby. And I remember my husband and I, because we both had children, and I also think the more kids you have, the more things when each child is born that you find you don't need.
Mm-hmm.
With my first kid, I had like everything under the sun and realized I used like 60% of it. And that you don't need to buy toys, because they're not going to be playing with toys for a very long time. So we were going back and forth on a diaper genie, like, should we get one? Like, eventually if you don't clean them, they smell. And like and then I just had a moment like, isn't this crazy? We are randomly in Target having like a debate on a diaper genie. So, so we on our own went and got everything. Well, obviously it turned out that we were going to be, instead of unpacking a crib at our home, we were actually going to be shipping a crib. So when we moved, he actually ended up buying another crib. So, we had 2 cribs, because I had to have one there in Texas for Levi. And so, I had to buy all of his clothes and diapers and everything he needed for when he got home from the NICU.
Wow. And was she still alive when you got to the hospital, or she had already passed?
Yeah, she had already passed because she had passed that Friday early morning, and I believe I went to Texas that Tuesday. And then I flew in Tuesday evening, and then it was Wednesday morning, I believe, that I actually went in there. So I mean, people ask me like, oh, what did she say? And I never spoke to his ex-wife ever, like only her family, and which they had never met me, but I guess in their minds, anybody that would be willing to do it, they were happy with. The sister, I still don't know that she didn't have a very big family, and I don't know why they wouldn't take it. I know the sister was younger, and it would probably have been harder for her, and she probably wasn't really able to take him. And so yeah, it was crazy. So then my husband, he moved everything, and then we had like a backup crib and all of his stuff. And I just never got to speak to her or to tell her, like, don't worry, we'll take care of him. So, we never got to have that conversation, but, I'm hoping that now she's free and, is able to see that he's loved and cared for now.
I'm sure she's watching.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other children, how were they about moving? I could only imagine. Yeah, I have children, and it would not be
Mhm.
easy to move everybody that far across the United States.
So I think, okay, so my daughter, she was more not upset about moving, but that Levi was a boy and not a girl because she wanted a sister. Even though she had one, the sister was older. She wanted to be the older sister. I think Austin and Dakota are Levi's biological half siblings. So
Hmm.
Austin was kind of on board with it. I think he was probably the most comfortable with the move. Then my older son Vance, he had the hardest time because he had really built a good, peer group, was in football, and we were right in the middle of football season starting. And so when we moved, he went through a lot. I think he kind of went through a little bit of a depression during that. And I had to be like mindful of it because, not only that is all of us kids don't know any better. Now you got a baby that cries at night and wakes you up. And, so it's like there was just all this acclimating, and he stayed in his room quite a bit and just started to kind of distance himself a little bit from the family. I think it was just a lot for him. But I had reached out when we first moved to the coach at the new school and said, hey, we had to make this move suddenly, and I know you're in the middle of football season. Is there any way that you can have my son join the team? They agreed, and I think just having him jump into the football team there, that really helped him. He got to build a peer group. The only thing is once the adoption was final, we decided to come back to Ohio. We had considered living in Texas, but I think for me and my menopause starting, it was way too hot. Like, I was extremely miserable. Even in the morning, I was sweating. I'm like, I don't know if I want to be like this uncomfortable. And so we decided to come back, and this time we ended up buying a little farmhouse. And it was kind of that switch of, again, now the kids had to move again when they finally were starting to adjust to those kids. But thankfully, they are in a little tiny school now, which I didn't know how they would feel about it because we live in rural Ohio. But now, even we make jokes, we hit the lottery, we move, and all of them said they'd stay here. So that makes me happy that we went through all of this, and it wasn't easy, but it's now kind of worked out for everybody.
And can you tell us how long he was in the hospital and what it was like when you brought him home? Was he addicted, and was he crying?
So he was actually not in the hospital as long. He was in the hospital for about 2 weeks after he was born. He was only 4 pounds 9 ounces when he was born. He did go through most of his withdrawals the very first week,
Hmm.
and when I got him, he was still going through them. Like most babies, they could suck their thumb in the womb,
Hmm.
And I could tell he wanted to suck his thumb, but his hands were clasped so tight. And then when he would cry, he would beat his face and he would just scream like, he was coming off of some of the addiction. Now, going back even more, when Dakota was born, my husband, who's gone all the time, she got back into her addiction, I think through pill form and other forms. And so when Dakota was born, CPS actually got involved because, with my husband being gone, he had no idea she was still using pills and others. I think it was like benzos and some other stuff that Dakota was addicted to. Now, her withdrawals, he told me, lasted over 6 months. They were so bad with her. So I was expecting that with Levi, but I would say the calming of it was probably a couple months after he was born. He really struggled for the first year with hand coordination because 90% of the times his hands were just clasped really tight. But after that time, they had even done some tests on him and everything, and he was finally catching up, and he was able, his mobility was starting to catch up, but it did take a while.
And he's where he should be for his age now, running around playing and
Yeah, he is. And actually here in Ohio, which I'm from California originally, and I moved to Ohio like a little over 7 years ago, right before I met my husband. They have public preschool at 3, long as they're potty trained. And so we worked really hard because he wanted to go to school so bad, like the other kids. And literally, I think 2 weeks after he turned 3, he was able to go to school, and he was really ready. So now he's probably even more advanced than my other kids were at 3. The combination of, I think, being more mindful when a child is born addicted, that they probably need a little more attention or a little like reminding of certain things that you're trying to teach them. But yeah, he's very, very smart. And then he's also, like I said, the little kid amongst the big kids. So I think he's probably a little bit more advanced than they all might have been at 3 as well.
yeah, he probably picks up a lot from them.
Real quick. Yeah, everything. Like everything. You're like, watch your mouth.
Yeah. Oh yeah. A teenager.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's funny. How long were you in Texas altogether?
We were in Texas, I think 16, 17 months. Um, but so even crazy story, and again, I share this a little bit in my book. So prior to my husband and I even knowing about Levi, where we lived at before we moved, we had a little Bible study group that came over, and it seemed like we had 3 other couples, and they would come to our house, or we would take turns going, and it wasn't even really a Bible study. We ended up socializing way too much, but we started out as a Bible study. 2 out of those 3 couples were all trying to do fertility stuff. Like one had a kid and they were going through IVF. And so we would like pray for that. And I don't know why. I mean, I was 46 maybe at the time, turning 47 or something. My husband's like, yeah, we're gonna try for one. And I'm like, what? Like, I'm kind of too old for that. And I was like, I kind of just had left it like, either way, if it happens, it happens, but I highly doubt it. And so I had actually decided, okay, well, let me just go to a fertility specialist. And they were like, yeah, well, because of your age, you'd probably have to start taking hormones, and then we'd probably have to use like egg donation. And they went through like that whole process. And I'm like, that just sounds like just so much. And so I decided I was just going to go to like the best doctor I knew and just start praying to the Lord about it. And I was just going to make a commitment, because he tells us, sometimes when you pray, you just pray like, oh, can you give me this, Lord? And it's not a true desire of your heart. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to make a commitment to just kind of pray. And then if it's God's will, then it'll happen. So as we're going through Bible studies and time's moving on, every night I just was kind of praying, Lord, if it's your will to have us to have a baby, and then I just put it in your hands. And I started having these dreams about this little boy. And sometimes he was a baby, sometimes it was a toddler, but it was a little blonde hair, blue eyed baby, which my children are not blonde hair, blue eyes. They are dark hair with like hazel eyes. And And so I just kept having these dreams. So I was sharing with our group that what I was praying about for me and for them too. And that I kept having these dreams. So the joke was the older woman was going to probably be the one that was going to end up being pregnant. But little did I know, I felt like it was just God preparing me for this child that was coming my way. And so when I walked in, part of it, of my love for Levi, is seeing this person that God had put on my heart, and like months earlier, like we didn't know that the ex-wife was pregnant. We didn't know anything. And then here I was after having these dreams. I even thought I started taking prenatal vitamins. I thought it was a sign that maybe maybe my mind or maybe consciously, I've never been one to say, oh, I have premonitions or anything like that. But it just, everything that led up to that was just, I felt God's hand in it big time.
Wow, that's amazing. That really
Mm-hmm.
is. Did the other women get pregnant?
One finally just had a baby, I think a year ago. So it took quite a time. I think the other one, they unfortunately, I think they probably were getting on the list to adopt. They just were having fertility problems. Yeah, it was, I mean, I can't imagine, being pregnant in my late 40s, early 50s, but it is weird though, knowing that when Levi graduates high school, I'll be in my 60s. And, good thing we're in a small town. They know that we're mom and dad. Otherwise, we would definitely get mistaken for grandparents. I've even had that happen now, especially if I'm with my older daughter. They'll like try to figure out who's mom, and some people are just, they don't have a sensor. They're like, yeah, so who's mom and who's grandmom? And I'm like, well, I'm mom and
Yeah.
that's sister, and we live in a rural town where a lot of people have kids a little bit earlier. So a few times we've been mistaken as grandma and grandpa, and I'm offended, but then I forget, well, technically I could be his grandma. I mean, but so.
Yeah. And was his ex-wife the same age?
No, she was pretty young. She was only like 35, 36. So it
Oh,
was pretty sad. She was very young when she passed away. So yeah, she was pretty young. I think the biological father might have been about my age. But I don't know. I saw him a few times, but didn't actually ever talk to him directly.
wow. Yeah, that's really young. And how long were you in the foster care system?
So I went into the foster care system. I was 14 and then I aged out at 18. So I think it was probably like the late summer of turning 14. So when I got placed in a foster care, I was placed into an emergency home. And, I've been asked, what was I thinking or what was that like? And I think for me, when you come from going into foster care because you have an abusive parent, for me at the time, it was more of just, if he finds me, he's going to be really angry, upset at me for telling on him. And, I also went through the backlash of my dad's family of saying, you're a liar. That didn't happen. That's not true. But, I know my truths. And also, through time, my dad many times had asked for forgiveness. And he actually, I think he was an alcoholic at one point. And I think me being put into foster care kind of nipped that when he realized that it was getting so bad that you're losing a child over it. So.
Right.
Yeah, so, and then, then I ended up being put into an institution because they didn't have any other foster homes. And unfortunately, when I was in that institution, I ended up getting SA'd by one of the counselors who, in the middle of doing his act, another counselor walked in on it, and that's how he ended up getting caught. But at the same time, it was rough for me because instead of, I think in that situation, they didn't know how to handle it, and I felt like they were more on the guy that side that was victimizing me than my side. Like, oh, are you going to tell on everybody? Like, because they were limited on, the one that walked in was only limited on what she could share with everybody else. So I started to feel like they were turning against me. Like, I should have been protected and these should have been protecting adults, but instead it was the other way. And it was just a terrible experience. I ended up having to go to a quiet room, and it was just so, dealing with that trauma and then knowing you can't trust adults, that's what kind of set forward my, I never want to come back to the system, again, because that's what I experienced. And things I didn't want for Levi or any other kids. And I definitely wish we had a bigger house and more space. Maybe when our kids grow up and the boys move out, we can open our home. But right now, I also have to be mindful of I got 5 kids, and
Right.
you want to give them a childhood that's where I'm not constantly overwhelmed either.
Hmm. And that must have been hard aging out. What did that look like for you?
For me, I ended up going into the military because I had no idea what I wanted to do. It was like a strange situation. So I ended up getting like kind of adopted by my foster mom, and I don't know why I was just a broken teenager then. I was so nasty to her. We got into an argument and I left literally 2 days before I turned 18. Of course, she had to file a report that I ran away, but after 2 days they just closed it out because then I became an adult. And so I was like, I didn't have anybody. Now looking back, I did have somebody, but I chose not to. And a lot of that was just because I couldn't believe that somebody could love me, because my parents didn't love me. So why would this stranger, and even though I know and knew she loved me, especially looking back now, I just couldn't grasp that concept. So I ended up just joining the military, and I kind of decided when I was in boot camp that I was just going to be better than where I came from. And it just kind of started a domino effect. I mean, I still had the trauma monkey on my back for years. And I think even now at 50, still sometimes working through things. But yeah, I ended up getting an advanced degree, and now I work in IT, and I never got in trouble with the law or addiction. I just wanted to be the opposite of where I came
Right.
from. And so yeah, it wasn't an easy process. I don't know what it would have been like if I would have just, if I got guardianship, but if she hadn't, I don't know. I think they give you like a time limit to get out, and you have to move on and come up with a plan. And that's so much that I wish they would work on in the system, because it's not like the day you turn 18, you got things figured out.
Right. Right. And I know a lot of young adults, teenagers end up on the streets because anywhere to go.
Yeah, or even go fall into the trap of addiction, because it's a
Mhm.
lot to put on kids, and then they end up going somewhere, and now we're repeating the cycle all over again. And I mean, I obviously think they should give them a little bit longer, like, even up to 20 years old. And, obviously a lot of them can get their college paid for and continue counseling, and how they could help those adults be better, mentally and capable of going out and into a world that kind of really turned their back on them at one point.
Right. Right. And can you tell us a little bit about your book and where your book is available?
Sure. So my book is titled Life's Sad Story, God's Love Story, and it's available on Amazon, any book retailer, but usually everybody gets it off Amazon. So I have always thought about writing a book, but when our story kind of was out there in the public, I decided, you know what, it's time to write a book about it. I wanted to share what led me to foster care, to becoming like an unexpected foster mom, and kind of what that journey was like, especially, like I said, from somebody that swore they'd never become a foster parent to having this tragedy come into our lives when I was having to go revisit my own tragedy. But as time went on, I got to see this love story, kind of transform, or even look back at my life if certain things or things domino in certain ways, because I'm not from here in Ohio. My mom was actually born in a part of Michigan that's like an hour from me. And I just decided I wanted to leave California when my oldest graduated high school and was going off to college. And so I just randomly moved here and randomly met my husband, and then chain of events just kind of led me to the life that I have now, which is really everything I dreamed of, having. It's not perfect, of course, marriage is not perfect, being a mom's not perfect, but it's pretty close. If I think back, these are the things that I prayed about. So I share that journey in my book. I'm actually writing another book, because to do a nice little plot twist on that, I found out my father passed away in March, and he was a darker Mexican man. And growing up, I grew up in a very Mexican family, but obviously if you look at me, I don't look Mexican. And I just decided just to take a DNA kit, more of, I think I kind of had a feeling he was probably not my dad, dad, but at the same time, if he is my dad, like, can I find other family members that we never knew about, etc. But it turned out he was not my biological father this whole time. So that was pretty mind-blowing, that the man that you ended up going into foster care because of caused a lot of, trauma, which my dad and I, we did go through our forgiveness state. He still favored my brother my whole life over me, and I tried to let go of that many times in my life, but it turned out he was never my biological father. I did find who my biological father was. He was just as surprised as me, because I'm 50 and he's in his 70s, to find out he had a random kid. I guess he met my mom in the 70s, and it was just one time random. He barely remembered her. And it turns out I'm not Mexican. I'm actually Italian and Irish. Yeah. So it was a lot to process. Like, I even look back at my younger pictures after I got to see what he looked like, and everybody always just thought I looked like my mom, who was a blonde hair, really light skinned woman. And we just always thought I just took completely after her, even though my brother looks like my dad, but he looks like he's mixed between white and the darker Mexican color that my dad has. But no, he was never my dad. I don't even have any Mexican in my DNA whatsoever. So that was a lot, because now I realize I look like a total stranger, and I have a whole different DNA makeup. And I've definitely gone through, what if he raised me and not the family? Because we're not really talking now. I think for him it's just a lot, and I don't know. I think he feels like at our age to start up a relationship would be strange, but I just kind of put the ball in his court. But yeah, it was a lot to find out that your whole life was a lie. My mom had made jokes like, "Oh, that's not your dad." And I said, "Well, then you should tell me who my dad is." And she'd go, "I'm joking," because I think she just didn't want to have to go visit the fact that, and I wonder if my dad knew, because I was treated so differently than my brother. Like, my brother could do no wrong. He was babied. I took the blunt of a lot of abuse growing up, because my brother will be like, "Oh yeah, our childhood, this and that." I'm like, we had two different childhoods, even though we lived in the same house. And, my dad's really dark Mexican, borderline African American color. And, I'm sure he probably been like, "It's just my kid," because my brother looks Mexican and white, but I didn't.
Right.
But I don't know. So now I'm starting a book about finding that out. And then in that process, my mother's father is also Mexican. And she's like Mexican and German, but she looked super white. And it turned out there was a rumor that my mom wasn't her dad's child. But, this was like the 50s, 60s, kind of a hush hush under the table. But it turned out that was not her dad either. So it was just crazy how. Uh, so it's like I'm finding out all this little family secrets, and finding out all these weird things that my mom and I had in common. Like, she was actually put in a mental facility from 14 to 17. The stories why behind that kind of differ, and I just think how crazy, because at 15 years old and my mom at 15 years old, we were both put, and we were in a mental institution. And same, we didn't who we thought was our dad was not our dad. And, so it was a lot to take in, but I also was like, I kind of ends with us. I didn't want to keep that trauma. I think my mom was a bad parent because of not having parents that probably loved her properly. And she just was on a survival mode, because she abandoned my brother and I in a daycare when I was like 2. My brother was about 9 months old or something, and she left, and I didn't see her again till I was 5 or 6. And she was an addict for a long period. And I now, as an adult, when I find the things out about her, I realized, instead of being angry at her, I just realized that she just had so much trauma. She didn't even know how to probably love other people, because she probably didn't even love herself. So it's kind of like becoming a detective of the process of finding out who my dad was, finding out things about my mom. And so that's what I'm working on now. It's a lot.
you went into, or when she abandoned you at the daycare, where did you guys go?
So my dad actually raised us. So my mom left when I was 2, and so my dad had custody of us until obviously I went into foster care. Now she made a appearance when I was about 6, and I think at the time she was just lightly using drugs, and it progressively got worse. And then there was a period of time where she didn't show up. We didn't see her. I again share my book. I would go on drug runs with her, and I think it wasn't until my probably going into foster care that she actually stopped doing drugs. And so even through my teenage, I had so much resentment for my mom, even though my dad probably did just as bad stuff to me. I just had all this. But when I gave my life to Christ, I had to forgive her, because that's what's kind of put on me. And thankfully we had a really decent relationship. It wasn't perfect, because even though I try to let go, the resentment was always there. But she passed away like almost 23 years ago. So and it makes me sad that she's not here, because I found out all these things, and I feel like if she was, I always think like, I don't know, finding out about my dad or give her a hug.
Yeah,
So
I'm sure you have more of a,
yeah, I know I would. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's a shame you didn't get to experience that when she was alive, to let her know that, the what you guys had in common.
Yeah. And I think also the 20 something year old me did not have as much compassion as the 50-year-old me. So I also think, she probably needed more compassion than she was ever given. I mean, thankfully she had a great husband that she was married to he was 18 years. I still talk to him now. I call him dad. And I think part of me is, even though I didn't have the best relationship with the dad that I grew up with, I told my biological dad I wasn't looking to gain a dad, because between the dad that I grew up with and then my stepdad, who I really love a lot, I feel like that need has been met, that I wasn't looking for anything in particular.
Yeah, that's good. Very
Yeah.
nice. And thank you so much for doing this with us. And I'm going to attach your book. I can't wait for the next book to come out. Sounds very interesting. And your TikTok pages, or your TikTok page. And do you have Instagram?
I do have Instagram. I can send that to you. Yeah. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. It's all Christie Werts. So even if you Google my name, it can go to all of those. And I share a lot of our journey, and then, a lot of times I do just silly parodies of things. And I think that I have to be silly, otherwise I feel like I'd lose my marbles, having so many kids and all these activities that I got to do. I think social media for me, or even writing, is a way to kind of just remember that I'm still a person. I'm not just mom and a working person, or just the wife, have that moment of being Christy.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Yeah, thanks for having me, and good seeing you.
Nice seeing you.
All right. Talk to you later. Thank you.